Your hand freezes an inch from the light switch. Across the dark room, a face is looking back at you. It isn't moving. You know it isn't moving. It's a mannequin, you tell yourself. Just plastic and glass eyes, nothing more. Your body doesn't care what you tell yourself. The hair on your arms is already standing up, and no amount of reasoning is going to bring it back down. There's no danger you can point to, no threat you can name, nothing you can actually do about the feeling except stand there and let it pass. Why does something that has never hurt anyone, that has no pulse and no intent, get to override your nervous system like this? But the real answer is far stranger than an overactive imagination. By the end of this, you'll know why the English language didn't even have a proper word for this feeling until a psychiatrist coined one over a century ago. You'll know why wax museums and doll makers were dealing with this exact problem long before a single robot existed. And you'll know why modern psychologists now argue that creepy isn't fear at all, but something stranger, older, and far more useful. Long before anyone built a robot, humans were already unsettling each other on purpose. Funeral masks, ancestor effigies, carved figures meant to represent the dead, placed just close enough to human that the living would feel their presence. Across cultures with no contact with one another, this same trick shows up again and again. A face that's almost right is more powerful and more disturbing than a face that clearly isn't. The first real attempt to explain this scientifically didn't come from a roboticist. It came from a German psychiatrist named Ernst Jentsch, who published an essay in 1906 trying to pin down exactly why certain things felt unheimlich, a German word that roughly translates to unhomely or wrong in a way that's hard to place. Jentsch pointed to wax figures, ventriloquist dummies, and lifelike dolls, objects that were common in his era long before anyone had a robot to blame. His core idea was simple. The discomfort comes from doubt. You look at something and you cannot immediately decide whether it's alive or not, and that uncertainty itself becomes the threat. 13 years later, Sigmund Freud picked up Jentsch's essay and pushed the idea further in his own writing on the uncanny. Freud argued that the feeling wasn't really about doubt at all, but about something familiar becoming strange, a face you should recognize as safe suddenly reading as foreign. Doubt or familiarity, the two men disagreed on the mechanism. But they agreed on the target. Human likeness, pushed just slightly too far, has been quietly disturbing people for as long as we've been capable of making convincing copies of ourselves. It wasn't robots that first proved this at scale. It was dolls. 18th century inventors built mechanical figures that could write, draw, and even appear to breathe, and audiences of the time described watching them with the exact same mixture of fascination and dread you'd recognize today. One famous automaton could dip a pen in ink and write out full sentences on command, its glass eyes tracking the page as it worked, and reports from the period describe audiences going quiet in a way that had nothing to do with polite attention. Victorian doll makers eventually learned to deliberately simplify their products, rounding faces, enlarging eyes, softening features, not because it was cheaper, but because customers found the more realistic versions unsettling to have in a house full of children. Long before science had a name for it, toy makers had already discovered the danger zone through trial and error and quietly backed away from it. Wax museums ran into the same wall from the opposite direction. A wax figure of a beloved public figure, lit correctly and dressed convincingly, can hold a room's attention for minutes at a time, right up until a visitor notices the chest isn't rising and falling. That single missing detail, breath, is often enough to flip the entire experience from impressive to disturbing in less than a second. Curators have spent a century and a half quietly adjusting lighting, glass eyes, and even the humidity of display rooms to manage a feeling they could observe clearly but never fully explain. Then, in 1970, a Japanese robotics professor named Masahiro Mori finally gave the feeling a shape you could put on a graph. Mori was designing prosthetic hands and early robots, and he noticed that comfort rose steadily as a robot became more human, right up until it got close to perfect. Then comfort collapsed into something closer to revulsion, before climbing back up only once a robot became truly indistinguishable from a person. He called that dip the Uncanny Valley, and for the first time, engineers had a warning label for exactly how human to make a machine and how human not to. Here's where the story takes a turn almost nobody expects. For decades, everyone assumed the Uncanny Valley and Creepiness were basically the same thing, just two names for one glitch. Recent research says otherwise. In 2013, a psychologist named Frank McAndrew, working with researcher Sarah Kwonka, ran one of the first large studies actually trying to define creepiness scientifically instead of just describing it. They surveyed over 1,000 people about what made a person, place, or object feel creepy, and a clear pattern emerged that had nothing to do with obvious danger. The creepiest things weren't the ones that looked directly threatening. They were the ones that left you unsure. Unpredictable body language. Eye contact held a beat too long. A smile that didn't quite match the situation. Their survey also turned up something unexpected about the objects people described as creepy, not just the people. Old dolls topped the list again and again, along with clowns, taxidermied animals, and porcelain figures with painted eyes, and respondents consistently struggled to explain exactly why. It wasn't the object's history. It wasn't its condition. It was the same unresolved question every single time, the same one Jentsch had pointed to over 100 years earlier. Is this thing alive or is it not? And I genuinely cannot tell. McAndrew's conclusion reframed the entire feeling. Creepiness, he argued, isn't fear. Fear tells you to run. Creepiness tells you to wait, watch closely, and gather more information before deciding anything at all. That distinction changes everything about the mannequin in the dark room. Fear would have made you bolt for the door. What actually happened was smaller and stranger. You froze. You stared. Some ancient part of your brain wasn't trying to save you from an active threat. It was trying to resolve an unanswered question. Is this alive or not? And I am not moving until I know for sure. That freeze response has deep roots. Your ancestors lived surrounded by ambiguous signals that mattered enormously. A shape in the grass that might be a resting predator or might be a fallen branch. A person in the next camp acting slightly, unpredictably off, who might be perfectly healthy or might be in the early stages of something contagious. Sprinting away from every ambiguous shape wasted enormous energy. Ignoring every ambiguous shape got people killed. Evolution split the difference and built something in between. A distinct, uncomfortable state that keeps you alert and gathering data without committing to full flight. That state is what you now call creepy, and it's remarkably efficient because it costs almost nothing to stand still and watch a little longer. Compare the energy cost of each option and the logic becomes obvious. A full flight response burns real resources. A spike in heart rate, a flood of stress hormones, muscles primed for a sprint your ancestors might need to repeat several more times before nightfall. Doing that for every shadow, every stranger, every doll left sitting in an unexpected place would have exhausted people long before any real threat arrived. Freezing costs almost nothing by comparison. You stay still, your senses sharpen, and your brain buys itself a few extra seconds to gather more information before committing to anything expensive. Creepiness, in other words, isn't a lesser version of fear. It's a cheaper, smarter first response, built specifically for situations where the full alarm hasn't been earned yet. This also explains something that pure fear never could. A snarling animal doesn't feel creepy. It feels terrifying, and the difference matters. Terrifying things announce themselves clearly enough that your body knows exactly what to do. Creepy things withhold that clarity on purpose, or by accident, and your body has no clean instruction to follow. Mannequins. Dolls with eyes that seem to track you across a room. A stranger who stands slightly too close and smiles slightly too long. None of these are declaring war on you. All of them are refusing to resolve, and that refusal is the entire feeling. You can watch this exact old circuit fire in brand new context today. An AI voice assistant that gets almost every conversational rhythm right except one oddly timed pause. A digitally de-aged actor whose face performs every expression correctly but somehow reads as hollow. A stranger's profile photo that turns out, a few messages later, to be generated rather than real. None of these situations existed for your ancestors. The circuit evaluating them is exactly the one they left you, still running the same test it always has. Can I resolve what I'm looking at? Yes or no, and until I can, don't relax. Even the internet's own folklore has stumbled onto this pattern without realizing it has a name. Long lists of unsettling stock photos circulate online for the exact same reason old dolls unsettled Victorian children, faces smiling in slightly wrong proportion, eyes catching light at slightly wrong angles. Entire genres of unsettling short art fiction are built almost entirely around this one mechanism. A narrator or a neighbor who seems completely normal except for one detail that refuses to add up. Readers rarely need the story to explain what's wrong. The not knowing is the story. Which brings you back to the mannequin and to every version of this feeling you've ever had without a name for it. You weren't imagining a threat that wasn't there. You were running one of the oldest, most efficient pieces of software your species ever built, a system designed not to protect you from danger, but to protect you from deciding too soon. Your hand is still an inch from the light switch. You flip it. The room floods with light, the face resolves instantly into plastic and glass, and the feeling releases all at once, the way it always does the moment ambiguity finally breaks. That release is the whole story. Not a flaw, a resolution. The oldest, quietest kind of relief your body knows how to give you. Thanks for spending this time with the story behind that flinch. If you learned something new here, a like genuinely helps, and subscribing means you won't miss the next one. See you soon.